I never thought I'd betray my vows. But that night, as I stood in the dim glow of the barn, my trembling hands against his warm, powerful body, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never erase. My heart raced and guilt clawed at me, but I couldn't stop. And when my husband returned home early, stepping into the barn, the look in his eyes told me he already knew. Emily had always considered herself the picture of a devoted wife. At 32, her life seemed stable, almost too stable. She and her husband, Daniel, had built a quiet existence on their small countryside property. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable. Daniel was a hard-working corporate executive, frequently away on business trips. Emily often joked about being a part-time wife, as their time together grew shorter and more predictable. In the early years of their marriage, their love had been passionate and effortless. Date nights, spontaneous road trips, and endless conversations filled their days. But over time, that fire dimmed. Daniel's absences left Emily alone in their large farmhouse, surrounded by silence. She filled the void with chores, books, and tending to the horses they owned. Particularly one named Apollo, a stunning chestnut stallion Daniel had brought home as a surprise gift. To Emily, Apollo was more than just an animal. He was her confidant, her solace, and her escape. She often found herself in the barn, brushing his coat and whispering secrets she couldn't share with anyone else. While Daniel treated Apollo as just another part of the farm, Emily saw him differently. Like a guardian, a listener who never judged. But something shifted the night Daniel left for yet another week-long trip. Emily had spent the evening in the barn, lost in thought as she ran her fingers through Apollo's mane. The loneliness she had ignored for years weighed on her more heavily than ever. She lingered longer than usual, craving the comfort Apollo provided. Memories of happier days with Daniel tugged at her heart, but so did the pull of something unfamiliar, something forbidden. She convinced herself it was harmless, just a fleeting moment of weakness. After all, how could loneliness drive her to seek comfort in such an unexpected place? Yet, as the days passed and Daniel's absence stretched on, Emily found herself drawn back to the barn, to Apollo. She couldn't explain the connection she felt, the way he seemed to sense her pain or the warmth that spread through her whenever she was near him. What started as comfort quickly became an obsession, and as her feelings deepened, so did her guilt. Emily's days began to blur into one long stretch of longing and secrecy. Each morning, she woke up in an empty bed, staring at Daniel's side untouched and cold. The sound of his voice over hurried phone calls felt more distant with each conversation. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked one evening, his tone laced with fatigue. "Of course," Emily lied, her voice light but her heart heavy. She ended the call quickly, already glancing toward the barn. It started innocently enough. She told herself she was simply taking care of the horses. But as the days passed, Emily lingered longer in Apollo's stall. The rhythmic brushing of his coat soothed her nerves, and the quiet hum of the barn calmed the storm of emotions she refused to face. Yet something deeper began to stir, something she couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Emily noticed how Apollo's dark eyes seemed to follow her every move. She felt an unspoken connection in the stillness, a pull that sent a shiver through her body. She caught herself staring too long, her hand lingering on his muscular neck, her fingers tracing patterns she couldn't explain. Shaking off the sensation, Emily stepped back, scolding herself. "What am I doing?" she thought. But the thought vanished as quickly as it appeared the moment Apollo nuzzled her gently, his warm breath brushing her skin. The tension continued to build. Emily became obsessed with the barn, finding excuses to leave the house. She began avoiding calls from Daniel, afraid her voice might crack under the weight of her guilt. Daniel noticed the shift. "You seem distracted," he said one night during one of his brief stays at home. Emily froze. "Just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. But Daniel didn't look convinced. He began to ask questions about her time in the barn, pressing her about how often she went there. Emily brushed it off, but deep down, panic took root. She started deleting call logs and clearing her browsing history, terrified that even an innocent slip might give her away. Her nights grew restless. Lying beside Daniel felt suffocating. She'd sneak out of bed, wrapping herself in a robe and walking barefoot to the barn. Apollo would be waiting, always waiting. The sound of his gentle snorts and the warmth of his presence became her new reality, and she began to crave it more than she cared to admit. But the guilt didn't vanish. It grew. Each stolen moment felt like crossing another line she could never uncross. She told herself to stop, but each visit only deepened her need. And then Daniel's suspicions sharpened. One night, he stood at the kitchen window, watching Emily disappear into the darkness. When she returned hours later, disheveled and flustered, Daniel confronted her. "Where were you?" "The barn." I couldn't sleep," she stammered. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "In the barn? At midnight?" Emily's breath caught. She knew then that Daniel was watching. The walls were closing in, and the thin thread holding her secrets together threatened to snap. Emily's obsession with Apollo deepened in ways she couldn't explain. The barn became her sanctuary, a place where guilt dissolved, replaced by an aching need she didn't dare name. Every stolen moment with Apollo left her trembling, guilty, exhilarated, and desperate for more. It started with innocent touches. Her fingers grazing his coat longer than necessary, her hand resting against his strong chest, as if to feel his heartbeat. But soon, those touches felt different, charged with an energy that left her breathless. One evening, Emily found herself unable to resist. The night was still, the barn shrouded in shadows, and the only sound was the soft rustle of Apollo shifting in his stall. She approached him, her pulse quickening. "Hey there, boy," she whispered, her voice unsteady. Apollo turned toward her, his dark eyes locking with hers. The intensity in his gaze unraveled her completely. She reached out, brushing her fingers through his mane. His warm breath fanned against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. Her hand lingered against his neck, and she stepped closer, pressing her body lightly against his side. Emily knew she should pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned in, resting her forehead against his. Her heart hammered as her hands slid along his muscular shoulders. She felt safe, desired, even understood. The world outside the barn faded. There was no Daniel, no guilt. Only Apollo and the way he seemed to respond to her touch, leaning into her as though he craved her presence just as much. Her breathing grew shallow as she ran her fingers down his neck, feeling the heat radiating from his body. She didn't know what she wanted in that moment, only that she couldn't stop. Suddenly, the creak of the barn door startled her. She jumped back, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Daniel. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Emily froze, her body still pressed close to Apollo. The dim light of the barn cast shadows across Daniel's face, but she could see the confusion and the hurt in his eyes. I was just checking on him," she stammered, stepping away from Apollo as if that would erase what Daniel had already seen. "Don't lie to me," Daniel snapped, stepping closer. "I've been watching you, Emily. I know something's wrong. And now I walk in here and see," he stopped, his voice catching. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to explain it away, but the truth hung heavy in the air. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I feel so alone." Daniel's expression shifted from anger to something else, pain. But it wasn't enough to undo what had already been set in motion. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside her. Her body still buzzed with the memory of Apollo's warmth, and her mind raced with fear and guilt. The next day, Daniel left for another trip, but his departure felt different this time, more final. Emily stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the road, and a wave of relief mixed with dread washed over her. She rushed back to the barn, her heart pounding as she pushed open the door. Apollo was there, waiting, his eyes fixed on her as if he knew everything she felt but couldn't say. Emily approached him, her hands trembling. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his neck. "But I can't stop." Apollo didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, and Emily felt her resolve crumble. Over the next few days, she lost herself completely. She spent hours in the barn, brushing Apollo, whispering to him, and burying her face in his mane. The boundaries between comfort and desire blurred until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She began to neglect everything else: household chores, calls from Daniel, even her own appearance. All that mattered was Apollo and the way he made her feel. But the deeper she fell, the more reckless she became. She left doors unlocked, tracks in the mud, and strands of hay in the house. And Daniel was paying attention. One evening, Emily returned from the barn to find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Emily's stomach dropped. She knew then that her secret was no longer safe. Emily froze at the sound of Daniel's voice. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly as if trying to hold himself together. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. "We need to talk," he repeated, his eyes fixed on her. Her breath caught in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. What she'd say, how she'd deny, deflect, or excuse herself. But now, standing in the dim light of their kitchen, she realized none of her imagined scenarios prepared her for this. "Sit down," Daniel said, motioning to the chair across from him. Emily obeyed, her legs trembling as she lowered herself onto the seat. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the silence. "What's going on with you?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "You've been distant, distracted. And then last night, I saw you in the barn." Emily's eyes widened. You followed me?" "I didn't have to," he replied, his tone sharp. "You've been disappearing for weeks. You don't think I'd notice? I come home, and it's like you're not even here. But last night," he broke off, running a hand through his hair. "Last night, I saw the way you touched him. The way you looked at him." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she couldn't find the words to deny it. She wanted to, needed to, but the truth was already out. "Daniel, No," he cut her off, slamming his fist against the table. "Don't lie to me. Just tell me the truth. What the hell is going on between you and that horse?" The rawness in his voice shattered her. She broke down, sobbing into her hands as the words spilled out. "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm lonely, Daniel. I feel invisible. You're always gone and I'm stuck here alone. I never meant for this to happen." "For what to happen?" Daniel demanded. "What exactly happened, Emily? Did you?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Emily's silence spoke volumes. "Oh my God," Daniel whispered, stepping back as if she had physically struck him. "I can't believe this. I never wanted to hurt you," Emily pleaded. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It just happened." Daniel stared at her, his face pale. "You're sick. You need help." But Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. It's not like that." "Then explain it to me," he shouted. "Because right now, all I see is my wife losing her damn mind." The room spun as Emily tried to gather her thoughts. She felt trapped, caged by her own mistakes. And yet, even as Daniel's words cut through her, part of her ached to return to the barn, to Apollo's warmth and silent understanding. "I'll leave," she whispered. Daniel froze. "What?" "I'll leave," she repeated, standing up. "I'll pack my things and go. I can't stay here and pretend everything's fine. Not after this." His expression hardened. "And what about us? About everything we've built?" Emily wiped her tears. "It's already gone, Daniel. I destroyed it." He didn't stop her as she walked away. The barn felt different that night, colder, heavier. Emily approached Apollo slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached out to him. But this time there was no comfort. Only guilt. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, tears falling freely. "I can't keep running from what I've done." Apollo's gentle nuzzle brought fresh waves of grief. She pressed her forehead against his, as if hoping to absorb the strength she so desperately needed. A noise behind her shattered the moment. She turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his face shadowed, but his eyes filled with pain. "I had to see for myself," he said softly. Emily stepped back, shaking her head. "Please don't." "Don't what?" he interrupted. "Don't believe what I'm seeing? Don't believe that my wife, the woman I trusted, could betray me like this?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "I can't look at you right now," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I can't even be near you." He turned and walked away, leaving Emily alone with her shame. For the first time, the barn didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a prison, and no matter how much she longed to escape, she knew she'd already sealed her fate. Emily stood in the barn long after Daniel left, the weight of her choices suffocating her. Apollo nuzzled her shoulder, but this time his touch offered no comfort, only a reminder of how far she'd fallen. She backed away, her hand trembling as it fell from his mane. The walk back to the house felt endless. Every step echoed with guilt, her mind replaying Daniel's face, broken, betrayed. When she stepped inside, the house felt foreign, hollow, and unwelcoming. The walls seemed to close in around her. Daniel's suitcase was gone. She searched the bedroom, the closets, and the bathroom, but it was clear, he had left. The realization hit her harder than she expected. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened her. He'd simply walked away, and somehow that made it worse. Emily collapsed onto the bed, clutching Daniel's pillow. It still smelled like him, and that small comfort broke her completely. Her sobs filled the empty house, echoing off the walls as the weight of her actions crushed her. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Instead, Emily lay awake, haunted by memories, Daniel's laughter, their early morning talks, and the quiet moments they once shared. Moments she'd taken for granted. By morning, the house was unbearably silent. Emily forced herself to get up, but her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her eyes were swollen, her hair a tangled mess, and the hollowness in her face revealed the toll her guilt had taken. She tried calling Daniel. The phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She left a message. "Daniel, please. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say, but I need to talk to you. Please come home." The silence that followed was deafening. Unable to bear it, Emily retreated to the barn. Apollo was there, waiting as always, but something had changed. She couldn't look at him without feeling sick. The warmth she once felt in his presence had turned cold and heavy, poisoned by shame. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, stepping back. "I can't keep pretending this is okay." Apollo's gaze followed her as she turned and left. Days blurred together. Emily avoided the barn, unable to face what it represented. She barely ate, barely slept, and spent most of her time staring at her phone, waiting for Daniel to call. But he didn't. When a week passed with no word, Emily drove to his office, only to be told he had taken time off. The receptionist's sympathetic look said everything Emily feared. He had confided in someone. The secret was no longer hers alone. Desperation pushed her back to the barn. She found Apollo pacing, restless as though he sensed her turmoil. But this time, when she reached for him, the connection was gone. She recoiled, her stomach twisting. "This isn't love," she whispered to herself. "It's obsession." And it had cost her everything. By the end of the week, Daniel finally called. Emily's heart raced as she answered, but his voice was cold. "I need time," he said. "Please don't call me again until I'm ready." "Daniel, please." "No, Emily," he interrupted. "Not this time." The line went dead. Emily sank to the floor, the finality of his words settling over her. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and now she was alone. Truly, painfully alone. In the days that followed, Emily tried to rebuild herself. She sold the horses, including Apollo, unable to bear the sight of him. She started therapy, hoping to make sense of her actions, but the shame lingered like a shadow. She wrote Daniel letters she never sent, pouring out her guilt and regret. And though part of her hoped he would come back, another part knew some wounds were too deep to heal. One night, months later, Emily stood in the empty barn, the silence pressing in on her. The stalls were empty, the hay scattered, and the smell of horses had faded. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a graveyard for the life she'd destroyed. Months passed, but the emptiness inside Emily remained. The once vibrant farmhouse had become a haunting reminder of everything she had lost: her marriage, her trust, and her sense of self. She spent most days in silence, moving through routines that felt meaningless, weighed down by regret. She thought about Daniel constantly. She replayed the last conversation they'd had, wishing she could take it all back, undo every mistake, erase every moment she'd allowed herself to cross a line she could never uncross. But no amount of wishing could change the truth. One afternoon, Emily received a letter in the mail. Her heart raced when she saw Daniel's handwriting. "Emily, I've had time to think about everything. I still don't understand what happened, but I know I can't pretend it didn't. Maybe I'll never fully understand. What I do know is that I can't live with the person you became, the person you let yourself turn into. But I also can't erase the years we had together, the love we shared. This isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about finding peace for both of us. I hope, in time, you'll find the help you need. I hope you'll forgive yourself, even if I can't. Goodbye, Daniel." The words blurred as tears welled in Emily's eyes. It was over. Whatever small sliver of hope she'd been holding on to vanished with that letter. For days, Emily shut herself off from the world, letting the grief consume her. But eventually something shifted. She realized she couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't let her mistakes define her forever. She sought therapy, diving headfirst into the tangled emotions and traumas that had driven her to her breaking point. She began to unpack her loneliness, her insecurities, and the desperate need for connection that had led her down such a dark path. Through it all, she faced herself, the version of her that had betrayed not just Daniel, but also her own values and identity. It was painful but necessary. In time, Emily began to heal. She sold the farmhouse and moved to the city, where she no longer had to wake up to reminders of what she'd lost. She took a job at a local animal shelter, channeling her love for animals into something meaningful, something that gave back instead of taking away. But she never forgot Daniel. His absence lingered like a scar, reminding her of how fragile love could be and how easily it could shatter if neglected. One night, as Emily walked through the quiet streets of her new neighborhood, she thought about everything she'd learned: the dangers of loneliness, the importance of boundaries, and the devastating consequences of crossing them. She knew she couldn't rewrite her story, but she could make sure the next chapter was different. And so, with each step, Emily promised herself she would never let her loneliness consume her again. She would face her pain, not run from it. She would build a life rooted in honesty and self-respect, even if it meant starting over alone. Because some mistakes can't be erased, but they can teach us how to be better. What would you do if you were in Emily's shoes? Could you forgive her, or would you walk away like Daniel did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want more gripping stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stay tuned. Our next story is even more shocking, and you won't want to miss it.